Hi folks, it's time to return to part 3 of my series on the Z3660, a rather marvellous accelerator for those big box Amigas, the A3000 and A4000 series. Now hopefully you've seen parts 1 and 2 of this series already where I introduced the Z3660. If you haven't, why not? Really, you're going to be much better off if you have a look at those videos, particularly part 1, before viewing this video. But let's assume you have seen those parts, you know what the card's all about. It has some pretty remarkable capabilities at a very decent price. But so far, I've been trying it out in this machine, the A4000 desktop, and it works very, very successfully. But one of the questions that does seem to come up quite a lot is, does the same accelerator work properly in the A3000 machine? And if you saw part 1, you will know that I fitted that card physically into the A3000, but I didn't carry on and actually use it in the A3000, and part of the reason for that was the lack of DMA support at the time by the Z3660. In other words, if you use the onboard SCSI interface with the A3000, then you are going to get conflicts. However, now's the time to dive into that in more detail and look at the Z3660 in the A3000 because we had a beta firmware update. So let's get cracking with that. Now, the firmware I showed in the first 2 videos on the Z3660 was version 1.02. But Shanshe has been working on those and updating them and releasing beta updates on the Discord channel for the Z3660. And in fact, what I'm testing here is version 1.03 beta 3. Now that actually comes as several files. It's not just the firmware, but various support files also come with that update. So let's run through those briefly. First of all, there is the .jed file that we've got here, which is the firmware itself. We'll be coming back to that later on. Next, we've got boot.bin, which goes on the first partition of the SD card on the Z3660. Simple drop-in over what we got already. Likewise, we've got a new SCSI.rom driver file that just drops into the second partition. And also on the second partition goes this config file. We'll come back to that a bit more in a moment because the format of that config file has changed since version 1.02. Finally, there's also a new ADF file containing all the drivers for those extra goodies that you get with the Z3660. And I'm going to start there because, first of all, I've unpacked them into this folder, but it's worth just taking a look at those briefly. So we've got our drivers in devs and in libs and one new command in C. But before we come to those, we have the new ZTop application, which has received an update from the version I showed in the earlier files. So we need to update all of these as we go through the process. The other thing I want to call out here is that there is a new file that has arrived in the various driver files that we've got here, and that is here in libs. What do we see but a warp3d.library file? So yes, Shanshe has developed the driver files for Picasso 96 to support warp3d. I'm looking forward to checking that out once we've got the firmware updated. But in simple terms, all the files that are on the ADF just drop it straight into the obvious directories. So updating those is quite straightforward. But let's have a look now at those config file updates. So let's have a look at that config file in a bit more detail. On the left here, I've got the new format of config file, and on the right, I've got the config file that I've been using to date. And you can see that they're both looking pretty similar. They're both text files, and you can go in and edit them to get the right settings, but there are some differences. So let's just walk through this briefly by looking at the new config file on the left. First of all, you select the boot mode. That's exactly the same as what we had before, and the CPU frequency. Again, that's exactly the same as version 1.02. But when we get to kickstarts, that's where things change a little bit. On our old version 1.02, we simply used this kickstart command and then gave the directory where the kickstart file was. Things have changed a little bit now in version 1.03 in the sense that we can name up to 9 different kickstart files, numbered kickstart 1 to 9, and give the directories of each of those, and then use the command kickstart and a number which selects which one of those we want to use. That's a slightly cleaner interface, and in this example, for example, kickstart 5 is being used, so that will mean that this ROM here is the one that will get picked up. We've also got an extension to kickstarts that's now supported, so and it's using a similar format to the kickstart files themselves, but now ext kickstart 1 to 9, and this allows us to name some extended kickstart files, which will be particularly useful if for some reason you want to use, for example, a 3.1 ROM but with the 68060 CPU, because 3.1 ROMs were designed before the 060 and don't work with them, so you need a little ROM in between to get exec working under 3.1 with an 060 CPU. So you can see in this example that's set up as X kickstart 1 and then selected down here with this command there. We didn't have the equivalent of that under version 1.02. So that's a nice little feature. Moving on, SCSI boot, yes, no, exactly the same as we had it before, but now we get to hard disk file selection, and that again has changed a little bit from where we were. Before we simply had SCSI 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and selected the HDF file location, and that's what we've got on the right here. On the left, in our new format, it's changed a little bit. We much like the kickstarts, define HDF 0 to 19 and the locations for that, and then map those to particular SCSI unit numbers. So you can see here SCSI unit number 0 is going to be HDF 0, which in turn will be this HDF file, and so on and so forth. We've got SCSI 0, 1 and 3 in this particular default setup. Moving on, auto config RAM, yes or no, exactly as we had it before, but then a new option here to enable or not the CPU RAM. So we can turn off that 128 megabytes of local CPU RAM if we wish, but there's a little note here that if we turn it off, that will also disable SCSI boot. Quite a neat feature that, to be able to turn off the local RAM if that for some reason is causing a problem. And moving on again, we have the settings here for the temperature sensor on the 68060 CPU, which does need calibrating and setting for each individual chip. They're all different, so there are instructions here for how to measure that and set it, but that was exactly the same as we had it before. But finally we have a new feature right at the bottom here, which is to enable chip RAM testing on startup. And I'm guessing here, but presumably that's if you're trying to diagnose a faulty Amiga, that's just going to work out whether the chip RAM's working or not. If it isn't, then that's a pretty fundamental problem, and you're going to have trouble getting any further with booting. So that's quite a useful feature, but I don't think I'm going to be using that in day-to-day use of the machine. So that's the new config file. I think what I need to do now is to update the new default config for my particular settings. I need to copy across all those driver files, the boot bin file, the scsi.rom file, etc. Get those all going before tackling the GED file and the firmware update. Well, we can't put it off any longer. We've done everything else. We now need to update the firmware on the Z3660. And in essence, there are two routes we could go with this. The first route is to use a Raspberry Pi and the general purpose I/O pins that it possesses to do our programming. We'll simply collect the right header pins there using some connection cables like this, one end on the Raspberry Pi, the other end on the JTAG connector on the Z3660, wire it up appropriately, and use that to update the firmware. So that's certainly a possibility, but I am aware that not everybody has a Raspberry Pi or is that familiar and happy with using the Linux command line. So maybe you're a Windows person. What do you do then? Well, in that case, you need some sort of interface that's going to provide the some sort of header connection that you can attach to the JTAG header on the Z3660. You need an interface, in other words. And the way to approach that is through something like this. This is a platform cable, to give it its name, and specifically the model is a DLC10 that has a USB socket on one end, so I can plug that straight into my Windows machine, and on the other end these are the connections coming out here through a header that will connect to my JTAG right the way through this ribbon cable, so very easy to connect. Now, I think from reading various posts on this that most people seem to be using Raspberry Pis for updating firmware, not just on the Z3660 but generally on computers, and Raspberry Pis are cheap and relatively easy to get hold of. So that's the route by which I'm going to do the updating in this video, but I will come back and just talk about what you've got to do if you want to go the Windows route and how you get that going. So let me put that to one side for a moment and come back to the Raspberry Pi. Now, when you buy one of these, first of all, it may not have the pin header attached to it, so you've got a soldering job to do to put that in place, and I've already done that here. But the second thing is to get the SD card set up correctly, so you've got the operating system on it, but also the correct packages to enable you to do the firmware updating. And you can go about that yourself, particularly if you're already familiar with Linux. But I think the easier thing to do is just to find an image file to put on the SD card where someone has done all the setting up for you in advance. And at this point, I'm going to call out the web page of Torsten Kurbad, Torsty76, thoroughly excellent guy who has done many hardware builds on the Amiga and sometimes has cards for sale. He's put together a web page, and I'll put the link up here somewhere. He's done a web page on setting up a Raspberry Pi, in that case for programming the BFG 9060 accelerator. Having said that, you can follow all those instructions down to the heading that says preparing the BFG 9060, and you will set up your Raspberry Pi to program any similar bit of hardware through a JTAG connector. So that's what I've done. I've got that installed on my SD card. I've got my connections. What I now need to do is turn attention to the Z3660 itself. So the JTAG connector is at the top here, this row of pins, and in my case inside this sort of metal surround. It may not be the case for yours depending on how it's been built. But what I need to do is to remove the Z-turn board from this card first, because I don't want that drawing current and I don't want to damage it in the process. Having said that, I do need to take care in removing this. It's connected by a pair of headers. If I turn the card over, you can see a pair of headers either end here with very finely spaced pins, and it's very easy when removing the Z-turn card to bend the pins of the headers. I don't know if you can see the plastic part of the header in there in black. Just take super care to when you're removing the Z-turn card, and clearly when you're putting it back on again. So that needs to come off. I also need to unplug the fan because I don't want that drawing any current while I am doing the updating. So I need to prepare this and then we can get going with the firmware update. Okay, so we're set up to rock and roll here. We've got the Raspberry Pi on the right and the Z3660 on the left here, minus the Z-turn card, which I've very carefully removed. Just to say the fan is unplugged as it was earlier. I don't want that drawing current really when I get this going. And what I've done is to connect up the header on the Raspberry Pi here to the JTAG header on the Z3660. And I appreciate it's really difficult to see all these connections, so I've got some stills here so that you can see what's going on. But suffice to say that all my connections on the Raspberry Pi are on one side of the header that side that's closest to the SD card, and all my connections on the JTAG header, bar one, are on the edge of the Z3660. The one that isn't is the earth connection, the ground connection, which is next to the little tab space in the outer housing of the plastic. It's on that side of the connector. Now, just to explain this a little bit more, the I/O pins on the Raspberry Pi can deliver both 5 volts and 3.3 volts. And either of those could be used to power the Z3660 and to do the flashing of the firmware. What I hope you can see is if I hold this right down here, this corner pin right at the most extreme part of the board in the bottom left hand corner as we're looking at it is plus 5 volts, and the one opposite it, which is right next to the SD card header SD card socket, is 3.3 volts. So you can use either one of those. Initially I tried 5 volts, so I had this cable in the opposite pin there and plugged the 5 volts in actually through this header that we've got over here that's labeled on the silk screen for plus 5 volts and for ground. That's what I connected to originally, and that will mean 5 volts gets put into the Z3660, and then the voltage regulator here will convert that to 3.3 volts, which is what we need to power the CPLD. The issue with that was the DC converter on the regulator board here started getting quite warmer after a while. So although I think that is fine if you're just doing a quick update, if you think this is going to take you a bit of time to do, maybe and you're finding that converter's getting hot, maybe the thing to do is switch it over to 3.3 volts. So that's why this red cable here is on the pin closest to the SD card. That's 3.3 volts. That can therefore get put into the first pin bottom right as we look at it here on the JTAG connector for 3.3 volts, and I can power the card on 3.3 volts. Then don't need the voltage converter, that's just directly 3.3 volts, and that will power the CPLD. So all good there, and this stays nice and cool. So you've got either option, only use one of them is the key tip. The other pins, wires connecting them up, obviously colors don't matter, that's just to help us distinguish what cable's what, but I must confess I always put the power plus power, positive power, as the red connector and the ground as black. If I always do that, I know I'm not going to get them the wrong way around, and the other colors are whatever they are, just to make the cable as neat as possible. So that's everything wired up. I've also got the Raspberry Pi here wired up with HDMI. I've got power in and USB for my keyboard, because I'm going to need to use the keyboard to type in the commands to do the firmware updates, and I've previously put the JED file on the SD card. So I'm all ready to go. I'm going to just hit the power here, and what we'll see is maybe this has got a little LED on the power switch here. You'll see that come on. You'll maybe see the activity light on the Raspberry Pi turn on and start flickering. It might be quite dim because it's flickering so much. And what we should see also is the power LED top right here on the Z3660 as we've got it oriented here. The LED there will come on to show power is coming to the board. So that's what should happen. We'll turn that on and allow the Raspberry Pi to get going. It takes a few seconds to boot, not like an Amiga that boots so quickly. Raspberry Pi takes quite a long time. So here we go. Power is on, that LED is on, that's on, and I don't know if you can see the drive access flickered a bit there. Oh, there it is. And let's just switch over whilst the Raspberry Pi boots up. So that's what it's doing. In the meantime, this regulator is staying nice and cool, the CPLD nice and cool, so we're all good there. So we'll just wait for the Raspberry Pi to boot, and then we can get cracking actually doing the updates. So to the command prompt, let's get going. First of all, I'm going to give myself privileges via sudo, then the command to actually do the programming, XC3SPROG, let's get that right. Then I'm going to give that the command switch -C, which says which device to use for programming, and then sysfsgpio_creator, which says Raspberry Pi, and then -J to check for the CPLD, and just above the command prompt there you can see JTAG location 0 and our device. So now I'm modifying the command line to actually do the programming, and perhaps I'll come back to explaining exactly what that command line does in a moment. Let's just get this right and set it going, and there we are. If it is programming, so again it starts off the same, super user do sudo XC3SPROG -C, and then that long name, that's all the same as before. -V, verbose mode, tell me everything that's going on. -P0 is program device 0. I've only got one, but choose the first one, and then the location and name of my firmware file, the JED file. Well, just as soon as I recorded that segment, Shanshe issued a further update to all the software, and we are now up to version 1.03 beta 4, which I have now installed on my setup. The process is exactly what I've shown you before, so nothing new there, but just for reference, I'm now on beta 4, not beta 3. The difference between two versions just seems to be some relatively smaller tweaks and bug fixes. But moving on from that, one thing that I did show in the video up to now is programming using the 3.3 volt output from the Raspberry Pi. But on talking to others about this, it's been made clear that the amount of current the Raspberry Pi can supply through 3.3 volts is relatively limited, and that might affect your ability to program some devices, maybe not the Z3660, but other things. In which case, the best thing to do is to wire up the header to use 5 volts, wire that in the case of the Z3660 in through the fan header, which is a 5 volt fan header, and go that way. And you might recall I said I tried that and the DC converter got quite warm. Actually, if you remove the 68060, then you don't suffer from that issue. Certainly that's what I found when I did it. So maybe 5 volts is the way to go with programming the Z3660. Finally, I did promise to come back to what you've got to do if you want to use Windows to do the programming instead of a Raspberry Pi. So first of all, you need that dongle, the platform cable, the DLC10 to do the programming. Then you need various software. First of all, the driver for the DLC10, and the way to get hold of that is a software package from Xilinx called ISE. I used version 13.1 of that. If you do an internet search for that, you will find it. You do need to register in order to be able to do the download there, but it is a free registration. And in truth, it may be possible to get by just downloading the drivers rather than the entire ISE package, which is quite large. But I went for the simple route and downloaded and installed everything to get the driver file. Once you've done that, you also need the XC3SPROG that I was using to do the actual programming. The Windows version of that is available as a binary from SourceForge. If you do a search, you will find that. And there is a final step, though, to get the software to work, and that is using a sort of intermediate application called Zadig. And what you've got to do is plug in your dongle and start up Zadig, and then you need to go into Options and List Devices. In the drop down, find Xilinx as the device, and then you need to go to the right of the green arrow, and from the selections there, choose libusb-win32. Just check that you are installing driver, and then click the big button. And not a lot seems to happen for a while, but it goes off and does its stuff and sets up libusb for Windows, and that is a necessary step for the XC3SPROG to talk to the device driver. Now, once you've done all of that, you're in a position to go. So open up a command prompt. I, from memory, think that needs to be an elevated command prompt, one with administrator privileges, which is the equivalent of sudo on Windows. And then the command line is just what I've been showing you on the Raspberry Pi, with one exception, and that is that the phrase that comes after the -C option on the command line, we now need to be -C and then space XPC, which tells us to use the platform cable for programming, not the Raspberry Pi's output pins. And with that, you should be able to read the JTAG chain just as I did and program the device. Right, I think that means we can now turn to the A3000. So here's the Z3660 reassembled with the Z-Turn card on it, ready to go. All the software and firmware updating on it is now done, so that's ready for use. And here's the A3000 for it to go into. So we're ready to do the installation. Well, not quite. Actually, it's just come to light that there's a further step to use the Z3660 completely within the A3000. Now, let me take a side step here to explain what this extra step is. Many Amiga 3000 users will be familiar with the int2 mod. In other words, connecting up the interrupt level 2 signal from the motherboard to the CPU, the internal CPU slot in the A3000. The A3000 was the first machine to have this CPU connector, and as part of that, Commodore didn't connect up int2 to it, whereas they did on the A4000. And the issue there is that if any software or hardware within the rest of the Amiga triggers an interrupt level 2, the CPU simply won't see it if it's on an accelerator card, because the signal isn't connected. So it's a very familiar mod for Amiga 3000 users to correct that and do a mod to the motherboard to connect up that signal. That's int2. Well, it turns out on the Z3660 that the audio and network drivers don't use int2, they use int6, in other words, interrupt signal priority 6, which is a very high priority signal to send to the CPU. In fact, it's the highest level of interrupt that you can mask out. And it turns out that on the Amiga 3000, and I believe the re-Amiga 3000, the int6 isn't connected to the CPU slot here. So that's the mod I need to make. It's just equivalent to the int2 mod, but this time for interrupt level 6. In case you're wondering, for these purposes, hardware purposes, there's only int2 and int6. You won't need to connect up anything else on your Amiga. But what I need to do now is not only dismantle this machine in order to insert the accelerator, but go that one step further and get the motherboard out, do the int6 mod, and then put it all back together. Then everything will work fine. I must confess, this is the first time I've come across this int6 issue, and that seems to be the case for many other users as well. In fact, I can't even think of another piece of hardware that uses int6 for this kind of signaling. But it does on this setup, so there we are. I just need to make the mod. So this is the A3000 motherboard post modification. You've seen this before if you saw my video on comparing the A3000 with the AA3000 Plus, the modern recreation of the prototype AA3000 machine. But we haven't seen the backside before. Here it is. First of all, this wire on the right as a mod is the int2 mod that I did many years ago to use other accelerators in the A3000. It connects up with one of the CIA chips underneath here on the other side. This is U350. The wire I've just added as a mod Coming down on the left to begin with and then ending up on the right is the int6 mod. It comes from the other CIA chip. This is U300 underneath here on the other side. It comes from the equivalent pin for int2 but on the other CIA chip, and connects down to the right pin on the Kel connector, the CPU card connector at the bottom here. So that's it. That's the mod that you need to do. It's not a particularly difficult mod to do, but if you're not confident about these kinds of things, because this can ruin your Amiga if you get it wrong, connect the wrong pins together, bridge connections, don't do it. Send it off to an expert who could do it for you. Not particularly difficult job to do. Anyway, that's the modding done. Those drivers should now work properly. I just need to get this board back in the machine and reassemble it all. Okay, so after a lot of effort, tightening a load of hex bolts and regular bolts, cutting my finger, etc., etc., everything is put back together so that this is more or less how the Amiga looks with the case off. What I haven't done is to plug in anything into the Zorro slots here or the SCSI hard drive port. I just want to test things sort of as a bare bones A3000 to begin with, but underneath there is the Z3660 ready to go. The HDMI output and Ethernet output cables are coming through here and out through a Zorro slot at the back, so I can access them. And I have got a floppy installed just so I can get through the boot process a little bit quicker with that installed. Otherwise, I think we're ready to go. I've got a keyboard and mouse plugged in and all the cables set up, so I think there's not much more for it but to hit the power button, and I will switch you over to the Z3660's HDMI output so you can see what I can see on that. What should happen is that this boots into Workbench, but of course this is Amiga land, so you're never quite sure what's going to happen. But here we go. So turning on the power light has come on dimly. Let's switch over sources, and we've got this wonderful boot logo that's telling me press C after power on to start the SD update tool. Booting. 060 CPU, bus frequency 50 MHz, Zorro 3 RAM enabled, SCSI boot enabled, which is all true. And I'm on the firmware 1.03 beta 4, which is exactly right because that is what I updated to. Now, if memory serves, when I switched the Z3660 over, I switched back to a regular Amiga screen mode just so I could start up from scratch all over again. So I think what I've got to do now is switch over the cables so we can see the native Amiga output. So let's do that. If I carefully here switch over the cables, there goes that output, and switch this into native Amiga output, we can actually check that this thing is in fact booting as promised, and there we are. We have a Workbench screen, and that means I haven't broken anything completely. So I think the thing to do now is to get this back into the nice HDMI based screen mode. So I am hoping that if I go straight into prefs and set the screen mode, it would have seen that I don't have any Z3660 screen modes. That might also explain why this looks quite as terrible as it does. So let's have a go and search for that. So that is already there. Maybe it is P96 prefs that I need to set up, which is here. I say P96 prefs, I don't mean that, I mean Picasso mode. So I'm attached to the board. A mode is not suitable for the board has been found. What do you want to do with this mode? Disable all of those. And then I've got everything else. So I'm going to save that and take a chance that that has actually worked. So let's reboot. And of course, from the Amiga's perspective, you don't actually see anything until we get to this screen saying that we're starting set patch. And what I don't have working is the hard drive activity light on the front panel of the Amiga, which is a little bit unfortunate because I can't really tell that anything's loading off the SD card. Right, now that seems to have swapped screen rows, so let me now switch the cable back again so that we can see what's coming out of HDMI. Hooray, there we are. We've got our wonderful HDMI screen back. Excellent. So I think the next step now is to take this as we've got it and then see if I can get DMA working off the hard drive attached to SCSI's the SD Mac on the A3000, because that's what this was all about. Can the Z3660 work okay in an A3000? All right, so the machine's powered off. I've got the physical hard drive in here, so that's now a DMA device connected to the internal SCSI port, so we can give that a go, see if it works happily within the system. Now, if I hit the power button now, what's going to happen is the boot priorities are such that it's going to boot off the physical hard disk here, not the Z3660's SD card. So I'm going to have to go into the early boot menu and change that over. So let's try that. The screen output is for the Amiga's native video, so we should be able to see what's going on. Let's hit the start button, hold down both mouse buttons, give it a few seconds to find the hard disk. Power light flashes, and there we are. Right, so what I need to do is to boot from the right device here, and I'm assuming that I don't want MM0, which must be the physical hard disk, but I want SDH0. Can't exactly remember the reasoning for the names of these things, but let me just use that and boot. And in the meantime, let me swap over the video so you can see what's going on. So can I. There's the video cable plugged in, and we have a black screen, so hopefully something's happening. There we are. Okay, so we're into desktop, or workbench I should say now, and suddenly a lot of extra drives are connected because I can see the physical hard drive, and I think that is this OS 3.9. No, maybe it's Amiga OS. There we go. That is the actual physical drive. So that proves that this is working with DMA quite happily. So I think what I need to do now is to change the boot priority of this drive so that I'm not booting from it immediately, but otherwise this is looking really good. Let's just do a quick show config just to check that this is what we're expecting it to show. So my physical 060 and the boot ROM, which I might not have shown you before, but I changed this over to be an A3000 boot ROM rather than the A4000 one that I was using on the previous machine. Obviously that's an important step to get this to work at all. And we have this oodles of extra memory here that the Z3660 is providing. So things are looking really good here. As I say, I'll change over the boot priority of the drive so I don't have to fiddle around with that each time. And then I'll have access to both drives, the SD card and the physical hard drive. Plus, I'm going to check out some things such as the sound and music again, and Ethernet speed, because I believe that Shanshe has been working on the driver for that and improved the speed of the Ethernet connection because if you saw my first video, actually maybe it was the second one, the Ethernet speed was a little bit disappointing. So let me check that out again and I'll report back. So one thing we haven't looked at yet is the new and updated version of Z-Top. So let's just take a quick look at that. And you can see the layout of it has changed quite a bit since the version for firmware 1.02. We now have some tabs here and various information I'll come on to in a minute, but what's really helpful here is up in the title of the window, it's telling me that I'm on beta 4 firmware, so that's quite handy just so that you could keep tabs on what version of the firmware you actually have installed. Down here it's repeating 1.03, then give me various voltages, CPU megahertz 50 and temperatures. Must confess I'm not quite sure why this is showing 0 for the 3.3 volts and 5 volts readouts. Don't know, might have to ask on the Discord why that is the case. But this tidies up the display quite a bit here. Then if we move on from the info tab to the boot tab, this is where it's telling me some separate information about the boot mode. So I'm on the real CPU with a CPU frequency of 50 megahertz and the various options that I've got set, including the Kickstart ROM and the extension ROM. In passing, by the way, one thing I have read is that not only does the Z3660 support 50 and 100 megahertz now, actually some users have found it also supports 80 megahertz, but not if you use this slider. You have to go into the config file and set up 80 megahertz there, and it will actually run perfectly happily. So for those who can't get their Rev 6 CPUs running at 100 megahertz, then maybe 80 megahertz is a compromised position. I haven't heard of anyone trying a Rev 5 at 80 megahertz. That's probably pushing the boundaries quite significantly, but I guess that might be possible. Would be interesting to know if that does work. And then our final tab here is the SCSI setup. This is just repeating things from the config file, but quite neat to have this all set out carefully like this. Now, in part 2 of my series on the Z3660, you'll have seen that I spent an awful long time running benchmarks just to check the performance of the card against alternatives. That took an awful long time, and there was lots of detail in that. If you want to see the details of it, do check out part 2 of the series. But as you've seen, I've updated the firmware and the drivers since then, so the question arises whether the views I had on performance have changed since part 2. So I reran the benchmarks and had a look at those. What I'm going to do is to show you the benchmarks where something has changed from last time. I'm not going to repeat all the figures from before where they're just basically the same despite the changes in firmware and drivers. So let's get cracking with that. First of all, RTG speed here. So we've got the various P96 speed tests going down the rows, and in the 2 columns we've got the figures from last time, version 1.02 of the firmware, and then figures from this time, 1.03 beta 4, and then the difference between the two. And I'm going to ignore the cases where they're basically the same results as last time. Which leaves me with, first of all, these two to point out, Blit bitmap and move window, where you can see there's some pretty significant speed ups there in the figures that I'm getting. Blit bitmap 179% faster, and move window almost the same kind of speed up. Considerable improvement there. But it's not all plain sailing. You'll see at the bottom there, con output actually slows down a little bit. Not quite sure why that is. But nevertheless, in the round, I think that is quite a decent speed boost in some of these different aspects of P96 that may give an improvement in the overall feel for the machine, depending on exactly what you're doing. The changes weren't all about RTG speed, though. Let's look at Ethernet speed, because if you watch part 2, you will know that I was a little bit disappointed with the download speed in particular from Ethernet. So these scores are from AMI speed test in kilobits per second. And version 1.02 of the firmware, I was getting a download of 804 and upload 4096. 1.03 beta 4, I do get a decent boost there. Now I'm at 1200 and a bit for download and over 5000 for upload. We've still got this weird thing going on where the download speed is less than the upload. I had to give some theories about why that might be the case in part 2. But nevertheless, that's quite a decent boost. Having said that, there is also circulating in the community Stefan's driver. So a user called Stefan has recompiled the Ethernet driver and optimized it along the way. And so I tried that out, and you can see there a very healthy boost to the download speed. I'm now 2800 kilobits per second. This is beginning to get a lot more like it. I have to say that others are seeing faster speeds than that still, so there may be something about my setup. Maybe if you're using a faster TCP/IP stack, or simply your router and connection to broadband is better, you may get faster results than this. It may just be me. So all in all, some really welcome speed boosts from the driver and firmware updates. Now, one thing I promised to come back to was that mysterious Warp 3D library that appeared in libs in the download. So let's remind ourselves about that. There you can see Warp 3D library. Ignore the top entry there, the directory. That's old stuff from the original Warp 3D. The Warp 3D library we've got here is in fact a version of WASB 3D with a Z in it, which is a software renderer for Warp 3D. And what Shanshe has done is to recompile that software renderer to run on one of the ARM cores on the Z-term board. So it uses that as a little sort of graphics processor, if you like. So the way to get that working is to put the Warp 3D library in libs, as I've done there, but you also need to download the WASB prefs application here that's available on AmiNet under the WASB 3D download, the full archive, but you only need this prefs file and its icon. Start that up, and it's important to set this entry here under renderer to soft to bitmap, because that's the setting that works. The other settings don't work. The other thing you have to remember to do, at least with this version of the software, is to leave WASB 3D prefs open while you do other things. I'm not totally clear why that should be the case, but that's what you've got to do. So let's just test that out on a couple of things. We've got the original Warp 3D demos, so we can run the original gears in a window. So there we go, that's running. I mean, it's difficult to tell because we don't have an FPS readout here, but I would say that's approximately the same speed as you get with an O60 running at 50 megahertz, which is what this is, with a Voodoo 3 and the original Warp 3D running on the Voodoo 3. So let's come out of that and just try one of the demos that comes with WASB 3D. And that's Cow 3D. So we'll set that going. And we have our 3D cow in space rotating for us. So just a quick demonstration that Warp 3D is working on the Z3660. Okay, it's not the fastest thing in the West when you are using a real O60, but it is there and working fully. So you know, games, whatever else that use OpenGL now get support from the Z3660. So there you are. We have been through the updating of the firmware and the associated driver files for the Z3660, and you've seen it fits physically very easily within the A3000 and works with it just as well as with the A4000. In particular, it plays nicely with the internal hard drive that's running through the onboard SCSI of the A3000. I did encounter one or two glitches with that occasionally, but nothing very significant, and no doubt a future driver update from Shanshe will sort even those problems out. But this card does work very well in the A3000. We've also seen a few little feature tweaks and updates and extensions in the software by Shanshe as well. Things like the updated Z-Top application, which give us a little bit easier control over how we use that accelerator. But I'd also call out the much faster Ethernet access we now have, and the Warp 3D driver, also very welcome additions. So this makes what was even before a great card, in my opinion, even better. I'm very grateful for having one and delighted to have it in my A3000. That brings us to the end of part 3. Join me again next time.